before we actually learn how to create tables, we need to go take a step back to our conceptual model, which was our ERDs. And here's a simple ERD here from employees and departments. And we need to learn a little bit about the process of going from that conceptual model to making the physical database. Okay, so we're going to change from the conceptual model to a physical model. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we usually do a table that looks something like this. Okay, and if we do this, it makes our job of actually creating the database a whole lot easier when we're trying to type our commands. So let's take a look at our employee. Remember our employee entity. We said it had a unique identifier for employee ID. We had a mandatory first name, the star is mandatory last name, mandatory payroll ID, and an optional nickname in this case. So how do we transform this? Well, each one of these attributes for this entity becomes a column. So the employee ID gets created as a column, and we give it a column name. And notice it's employee underscore ID because we're not allowed to use spaces in our column names. We shouldn't use spaces in our column names. Now, I say that Microsoft SQL Server will let you use spaces, but if you use spaces, then you end up having to use square brackets around a lot of things, and it creates more headaches than it's worth. So try to use good column names that don't involve spaces in them. Optionality. Well, if this is going to be the primary key, the unique identifier, we said for entity integrity, it has to be a mandatory key, right? So we're going to make this, it's a primary key column. It's the employee ID. The only thing that this chart doesn't include that I would include when I make this is the data type. Now, why doesn't this include the data type? Because the physical model is still a model that could be taken to any database system, and different database systems use slightly different data types. They do all use the ANSI data types, the standard ones, but they all have their own sets of data types too. And we're going to talk about data types in the next video when we get ready to actually create tables. So for each attribute, we specify whether it's a key or not, whether it's optional, and we come up with a good name for it. We give the table a good name. Notice what happened here. This was the employee entity, and we use singular names for entities. When we actually make the table, we use plural names. Now, not everybody does that. These slides are from Oracle. So Oracle tends to use this standard, or at least they teach this standard in their courses. We can see using Microsoft SQL Server, we have person.person table. It's not persons. So it may not be that way all the time, but many people do use that standard. Single entity names, but when you have more than one entity in a table, it makes sense to use a plural name for it. So what else? First name, last name, they both become columns, and they're both mandatory. Notice payroll ID is up here. So payroll ID, nobody can have the same payroll ID. So they set that up as a unique key. We haven't really talked about that too much. But a unique key is like a candidate key. I think we have used that term before. If something would happen and we want to look somebody up and we don't know the primary key, we could use the candidate key. In this case, their payroll ID. Social security number might be something like that too. If we're keeping their social security number, we wouldn't want to make that the primary key because we don't like using social security numbers unless we really, really have to, like filling out government forms. So we might make that a unique key. Okay? And then the nickname is down here, and it's an optional column. We did the same thing for departments. The department table has an ID for the primary key, and it has a department name. Now, I didn't talk about this last row yet. Okay? This last row is a foreign key, and it does not have a matching attribute in our conceptual model. Okay? We add the foreign key because the foreign key is what establishes this relationship. Okay, the foreign key always goes on the many side of the relationship. So there will be many employees related to a single department. So we put the foreign key on this side and it points back to the single department. If you have any one-to-one relationships, there's some other rules, but in general, it kind of doesn't matter which side you put it on in that case. There are some exceptions to that. We're not going to get into all those today. So know that the foreign key goes on the many side of the relationship. Okay? And that foreign key, in this case, it's a mandatory relationship. So the optionality is mandatory. And the column name, we try to use matching column names. So the foreign key column name here matches the primary key column name in the other table. Now we have a slide from a later portion of the Oracle Database Design Curriculum. We didn't actually cover Chapter 9. That's why I'm going over it now. And you can see this process. The mandatory relationship here becomes mandatory right down here for column name. They called it DPT_ID. I think what we had in this other slide over here, department ID, is just fine. It's nice when they match. They're giving short names or abbreviated names to all their tables. So for their foreign key names, they're using the short name. That just depends on the business you're at and how they decide to do it. Okay. All right, so the department ID points to the department ID of the departments table. Okay. What about this one? We had this relationship, and we didn't have that in the first diagram I showed you, but we have this relationship where employees manage other employees, right? So for each employee, we're going to give an optional column because if you remember, the CEO of the company doesn't have a manager. So this needs to be optional because he wouldn't have any entry for that table. That's an optional relationship. We don't see any mandatory. We don't see any solid lines up there. So this particular foreign key is marked as optional, and it's a foreign key that establishes the relationship from the employee table to the employee table. This key, this column name, will point to another employee's primary key. So somewhere in the process, after you've established a good conceptual model, you need to change it to a physical model and map out what each column in each table of your database is going to be as far as optionality, whether it's a key or not, what the column names are going to be. If you do all that before you start creating your tables, you will have a much easier time.